And now we go to our next speaker. And this next speaker is a panel, actually, that is considering examples of how innovation have empowered both decision makers and citizens to play a proactive role in managing disaster risks and providing more effective disaster response. Now, in a hurricane corridor like we're in right now, that's a very important factor in maintaining our quality of life after a crisis occurs. Let us welcome the head of the Global Facilities for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, Francis Ghesquiere, the Executive Director for the Council of Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, Ronald Jackson, and our moderator, the former FEMA Director and Senior Director of Emergency Management for One Concern, Craig Fugate. Gentlemen. Good to see you. Ronald, good to see you.
Comfortable chairs. Wow, ready? Hello, good morning everybody. Last year, 2017, saw one of the most active hurricane seasons, and here in the United States, the names of Harvey and Irma and Maria resonate. But I think we oftentimes forget here in the States, we weren't the only country being impacted by this past hurricane season. And this coming year, the seasonal forecasts are already starting to talk about predictions of a season almost as active, if not more active. Conditions will be very favorable for another hurricane season. If you look at the impacts to the United States, particularly if you look at what happened in the VI in Puerto Rico, one of the questions we're always asking is, what are we going to do differently next time? How do we get faster? How do we get better? And in that light, sometimes it's helpful to look at other partners that are doing this, not necessarily in the United States, but in other parts of the world, responding to the impacts of these disasters. And again, two of folks that I've met or worked with before, representing more of a international perspective of how we can use technology to change outcomes. Why do we have to wait to get the assessments to find out how bad it is? And why does this seem to be a pattern we've repeated over and over again? The storms hit, we respond, and then another storm hits and nothing really seems to change. The two folks up here with me and the work we're doing at One Concern is not just being able to respond better, but how do we build more resilient communities and nations against these threats? And when we build back, don't build it back the way it was, but build it back better. So I want to start with you, Ronald, because obviously with the Caribbean and the impacts we saw last year, I think, particularly in the States, I don't think we always have an understanding of how devastating this hurricane season was and how in many cases it was causing a lot of competition between the donor communities and volunteer organizations as they were dealing with competing demands across multiple islands and the nations that were impacted.
Yeah, it was particularly a challenging year for us, not just with Irma and Maria, but we had floods in some of the countries, which was also worsening the sort of limited resource scenarios in these countries. And so with two Category 5s, impacting very small island states with limited resources, it really showed the exact vulnerability that exists in many of these countries. And you raised the point about assessments and the challenges there. One of the major challenges we had in many of these countries is being able to navigate into the hilly interiors. Many communities, many small communities located in these spaces with very limited intelligence on what exists in these particular communities. And with a challenge in strategic airlift assets, you're really trying to get people into these communities on foot to collect information on the level of impact. One of the things we had to do immediately, noting that we had challenges with strategic air assets, was to rig a camera that was for security surveillance onto a small military aircraft and fly the entire islands within 6 hours after the impact. We got enough resolution to be able to see which buildings were without roofs, to be able to make, I would say, an initial detailed enough assessment in terms of the number of persons that were likely to be displaced and needing assistance. So that was one way we tried to get beyond the challenge of getting on the ground and collecting all of that information. But it was certainly a challenge. We had responders from the UK who were traditionally in the Caribbean seas. We had responders from Canada. We had responders from the nearby French territories. We had the Dutch. And we had to piggyback on some of those air assets that they had to try to fly relief supplies into these particular communities. But as I said before, it really posed a challenge and lengthened the time we needed to get into some of these communities and to assist. Approaching by sea was also a problem. So it really is leading us to think about how can we, one, equip ourselves with new technology, new assets that can allow us to get information from the communities. And a number of mobile applications are out there, but then when you look at the fact that the telecommunications sector and was devastated, then how do we get that information back from the communities, even if they have applications? So we tried deploying technology that could give us a sort of cell net, as well as internet capacities for 30 to 40 people. But getting that into all the communities was also a challenge. So it really was about setting up a central point and trying to feed information to that point and getting it out to the different communities.
Well, I know that there's a lot of different tech companies and people here looking at solutions, but you just identified, I think, two things that, whether it's in the States, whether it's international response, we see time and time again, is how do we get better assessment tools of what has happened and the issue of communications. Particularly what's interesting is you're talking about the public and how more dependent we are far beyond traditional telephones, but really the internet for our connectivity. And that, again, we saw this in the States, but disaster after disaster, we know if that system is disrupted or is not resilient, we're going to end up having to respond to that. Francis, you kind of take a little bit of a different take on this. You're not so much in the response side of this, as much as how do we build the mechanisms in the governments and communities to be more resilient and do better with jobs recovery, and look at really from the standpoint of the World Bank how we're investing, and not just investing in government stuff, but we're really trying to invest in eliminating poverty, make our communities more resilient, more healthy. But disasters have such a negative impact. That's your focus. How is technology being used at looking at these investments and how we can do a better job of building our resiliency and then recovering and building back better?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thank you for having us here. Morning, Ronald. Our job really at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which is a facility hosted in the World Bank. And just to clarify, the World Bank is an agency of the United Nations which funds programs around the developing world for poverty reduction. And I think for a couple of decades we have realized that there's a very strong link between disaster and poverty. Disaster really generates a lot of poverty. A lot of people who manage to get themselves out of poverty fall back into poverty because of adverse natural events. And so for the last 10, 15 years, I think disaster risk management, how to help government, people like Ronald, deal with the risk from adverse natural event has been a core focus of the World Bank. We've really tried to invest a lot in helping government better understand the risk, better reduce the risk, better respond when events occur. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a first technological revolution in this field, really, with the advent of computer power, of geospatial platform. We have we now have tools that allows us to work hand in hand with government to really visualize the risk and then to make decision on where to invest, where not to invest, to compare different risks, really sophisticated techniques that many of them who come from the insurance industry help us better intervene. But I think that we're now seeing a second revolution coming because all of these interesting technology, interesting concept, we're hitting certain boundaries, certain limits. And I think with the advent of AI, image recognition, and even more computer power, we're going to be able to push the boundaries of these technique and really, I think, have a even bigger impact on some of these interventions.
Well, when I was at FEMA, I think, I forget the total number of disasters, but some of the things we dealt with was, tropical or Superstorm Sandy, multiple hurricanes, Matthew coming up the East Coast, lots of flooding. And I know that from FEMA's perspective, as we were getting better at using geo platforms, we oftentimes knew what was there, but it was always slow. We're waiting for state and locals to do assessments. It was always this time delay between the event has occurred and we now know what the impacts are. And within governments, and I'm sure, Ronald, you'll see this even in the donor community, there's a hesitation to act until we know it's bad. But the problem is, by the time we know it's bad, we've lost days to weeks to change outcomes. And so from your perspective, what do you see are the needs? What kind of things do we need to have or build or develop to give you tools that allow you to reassure that donor community, those governments, that we do have that data, particularly when they've lost all communications and they may not be able to make that call for help?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think Francis touched on a couple of the very important tools, but also some of the emerging technologies. From our side, we think it is important to invest in what we call pre-impact data sets. Information on the fragility of the building stock, information on the vulnerability of the population. And this is all there. It's really, how do you bring it all together in a geospatial platform? But also, how do you use tools like the satellite imageries that are available now that can give you quickly a sense of the number of buildings, besides what I talked about earlier in terms of having to fly a plane across a country in particular and to get imagery. And depending on the size of the country, that may not be as effective in terms of the time that it may take for you to get this sort of pre-impact information. One of the tools we were testing during Hurricanes Irma and Maria is something we call Spatial Edge, which was interacting with the NOAA satellite information and producing analyzed data on the extent of the impact on a particular country. And it gave us I would say, fairly reliable information based on what was inside of the database at that time. And I think if we can get donors to believe in tools such as these, then once you're able to run this analysis using this real-time information, it triggers them a little bit earlier. So those are some of the things we're trying to do. We're trying to develop tools or access tools that can give us the kinds of scenarios that are near real. So it gives us a sense, if you're dealing with a category 5 passing directly over a small territory, what is likely to be the displacement. If we're talking about seismic risk, if you have a particular trigger point and the ground acceleration information, the fragility of the buildings, a clear sense of the amount of persons who are going to be displaced during nighttime versus daytime. And work with our donor community to have a sense and trust in this information as key situational overview on which they can rely on to release some of the resources necessary to speed up that response.
Craig, I think Ronald put his finger on really what new technologies are bringing into this field. And I would even add that now we almost don't have to wait for this disaster to occur, because we have now the capacity to build models that tells us what will be the impact of a hurricane. It's more difficult for an earthquake because they can be predicted, but of a hurricane. And then, of course, it's not going to be exact, but it helps people mobilize in advance, have a sense of where the major impacts are going to be, and then try to respond. But it goes beyond this, because you now have, and one concern is a beautiful example, you now have machine learning that allows you to educate the models and to have now the machine telling you, well, if you have this kind of impact, then this kind of response may be appropriate. I don't think that machine will ever replace human, but I think there's more and more tools out there that helps us, and I think we're still learning, but it helps us kind of have good advice and good ideas, things you may not have thought about, or things that you can't do when the disaster occurs. You can think about it in advance and then try to be even better prepared.
Yeah, I mean, that was what attracted me to one concern in the first place was how do we have a lot of science behind how buildings perform in certain events, whether it's a flood event, whether it's an earthquake, but the challenge has always been is doing that on a scale fast enough that you could use it both to plan for, respond to, but more importantly, it's kind of where you're trying to focus on, Francis, is how do we build differently before disasters hit? What are the things that are likely to go wrong that we can work on now? And when we are rebuilding, we're not just rebuilding back to the past. And so for both of you, a subject sometimes in the United States, depending upon who and where you're talking, is not well received by some and others, is we know what our past has been like, we know what our history's been like. But now as we see climate disruptions increasing, and we're moving into areas where we don't have data, we can't look back 100 years of weather to say what we should be building to. How is that affecting decision making and where you're making your investments and where you see the next challenges as climate change continues? Here in Miami Beach with increasing flooding from reoccurring tidal events, how's that beginning to affect your strategies in dealing with disasters, particularly looking backwards is not telling us what the future is going to be, but we're having to make investment decisions that have to withstand the future impacts of the climate disruptions. Francis, I know that from the standpoint of your investments, this is, in our discussions, this is one of the things that you are looking at, but how's that factored into where we make our investments and how we prioritize it?
That's a very interesting question. I don't want to be too technical, but in the last 10 years or last 20 years, we've learned to integrate risk in investment analysis. And risk is something you can measure. Right? You have probabilities, you integrate this in your analysis. With climate change, we now have a situation where we have a sense of the risk, but we also know it's going to change. And in fact, in many cases, we know it's going to change, but we don't know in which direction. People give a lot of credence to climate models, but many of these climate models around the world give you very contradictory information. There are very few places where a climate model will tell you, oh, there's going to be more rain in this country or less rain. One thing is for sure, there's going to be bigger variability. So we've now developed techniques to integrate not just risk in investment analysis, but uncertainty. Now the problem is to do this analysis, including uncertainty, we have to do a lot of scenario analysis to basically try to assess what are the scenarios that we don't want to pursue because it will get us into a situation that may not be what we want to be based on the future. And so again, with artificial intelligence, with the advent of computer power, we can now run many scenarios, and we can now have dialogue with government and advise them on scenario paths that they want to avoid. One consequence of this is quite interesting, is that more and more we are advising government against too much brick and mortar intervention, building brick drainage system, because if you don't know what the future is going to be, you may be stuck in a drainage system that has a certain dimension, and in building this drainage system, you may have destroyed a lot of the nature around a particular system, when nature provides much more flexible buffer systems. And so more and more we use this technique to advise government on future course, but also to recommend nature-based solution to deal with future disaster risk. And we find that it brings a lot of value in the way we do our work.
And Ronald, in your area of responsibility within the Caribbean family of nations, there's all sizes and sophistication of government, but the impacts are being seen for all of them. And so for your agency, how are you addressing this across all of the varieties of government and structures and resources in this threat?
Yeah, I want to thank Francis for his articulation of what he thinks is certainly a way forward. I'm in total agreement with him on that. It is the basis, going back to your question, we promote what we call the CDM strategy, the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy, which we see as an integrated risk management strategy which recognizes the cross-cutting nature of climate change and ICTs. Within the context of this strategy, there are 4 key pillars which we are promoting. One which looks at the institutional mechanisms, so laws, policies, financing, appropriate capacity, we can take investment in intelligence, etc. The second one looks at knowledge management, but how do we not just talk about public awareness campaigns and educating people, but how do we use information and data and analysis for risk-informed decision making. The third is on looking at the key sectors of the governments in the economic sectors in the countries. Most of them are tourism dependent. Most of them have very fragile economic bases and so forth. And agriculture is also still a mainstay in many of these countries. And the fourth is on community resilience building. This is what we push, and behind that, certainly the tools, the policy prescription necessary for looking at doing things differently. And it's a challenge, going back to what you said. You're looking at small countries with very small territories having to make decisions around where do we now leave as a buffer to allow these environment and ecosystem services to provide the adequate mitigative capacities. Now that's a challenge for small countries and a small government now trying to tell his population, look, we're going to have to move from a horizontal density to a vertical density in many instances. Getting that message across to the population is very, very challenging. And we're seeing that. We're seeing, even with resources being available in the case of some of the countries hit by Irma and Maria, the very slow pace of trying to build back better, trying to measure between the tyranny of the urgent and doing the right thing going forward. So, it's negotiations, it's working with people like the World Bank and the other development banks around looking at some of the policy-based approaches that will perhaps get a change of things from business as usual to looking differently at the spaces. The issue of land use and land management and enforcement is a huge concern. So even if we're talking about natural buffers, it really is about how do we ensure that when we're building back, we're also enforcing new setback requirements from some of these hazard areas, especially in light of the fact that we don't know exactly how this changing climate is going to impact on traditional hazards. So it's been a challenging journey for us, and that is why we use partnerships as well to try to get the change in behavior.
Well, I got one more question, because when I walked around the exhibit hall, I saw some tech companies, I saw a lot of other companies that are major employers. What is the role? I mean, again, when we looked at the three of us, we basically are coming from government or creations of government trying to manage this. But I saw American Airlines out there. I saw banks out there. Mm-hmm. All these folks out there that really depend upon our economies. What do you see their role, and how can we use this conference to leverage their presence and bring them into this discussion? Because we always talk about what government's going to do, but the reality is industry and businesses are the economies, and if they're not surviving or planning for this, our planning isn't taking us very far. And Ronald, given this audience out here, what else can we do to bring the business community into this so that they understand their role, particularly as we look at risk and decisions we have to make about where and how we build?
Yeah, no, that's very important. One of the programs we started on perhaps 4 or 5 years ago was trying to engage the private sector more, but also understanding what drives the private sector. We always say to them, look, you have to make sure your investment is robust enough that it is able to sustain these types of events, but also that it does not itself impose new risk on the communities. And that's the message we try to send to get them to come into the fold, so to speak. But we had to learn the whole idea of within. What is in it for me from the point of view of the private sector? What is this that we will get from taking a risk-based approach to our own investment, other than just that our business remains in place. So that whole engagement of the private sector is growing. We have a situation where we have memoranda of understanding with a number of them around how they can utilize their capacities to help us as a regional organization on the response side. But now we're trying to talk about how they can use some of their own techniques, technology, personnel to do corporate volunteerism within organizations such as ours or at the national level, to bring these new age approaches and technologies into the government sector per se, to sort of change the game. So it's an area, we're looking at the private sector through this lens of public-private partnerships, navigating, of course, certainly the fiduciary and accountability requirements now, where you have a plethora of actors who can bring something to the table, and engaging them, you have to now make sure that you're balancing between the accountability requirements and the access to the needs and the tools that they bring to the table. So it's still an engagement that is developing and emerging, but we ourselves, certainly at CDEMA, are being a little bit bold in seeking out what is emerging. So we're talking to some of the universities as well around research that's going on into AI, see what's emerging, to see how we can engage, and talking to some private sector firms who are coming to the table in a partnership where they are contributing either their program at a cost, a reduced cost, or pro bono, and we bring some resources to the table as well to together advance on a particular journey that solves a challenge that we face. So just looking at very creative ways in which we can engage them within that public-private partnership that we're exploring with the private sector.
And Francis, I know in our conversations previously, in some of the emerging economies, we're actually talking about the businesses have a lot more at stake and have been much more engaged. What's your experiences of working with the private sector and engaging them, and how do we build for future risk?
Well, I would say it varies a lot per sector, but you mentioned walking around this conference and seeing all these new ideas. To me, there's two aspects in working with the private sectors. One was you discover these amazing new ideas all the time. Last week I had a meeting with this company called Spire, which has almost 100 small satellites around the globe monitoring radio frequencies. And you were talking about the fact that sometimes the local telephone grid or all the antennas are down and you can't use, but when someone turns on its cell phone, it sends a pin that is automatically detected by those satellites, so they can actually tell you where the people are after a disaster, even if there's no grid, or even if you're in the center of, if you're in South Sudan and, well, maybe there is no grid there, but you can actually start locating people. So there are always these new ideas that are fascinating, and I think try to bring some of these ideas to help agencies like CDEMA in the Caribbean and other is a first step. But I think your question is how do we work with them? I think an important part of the work we do is to understand what's in it for them and why would they want to intervene. And many of them, of course, they want to be good citizens, but it's also just good business for them.
Absolutely.
To think about not only their assets in these developing countries and whether they increase the risk pool and whether they protect their factories and whether they know. But very quickly when they enter into this discussion, they realize that it's not just about their assets, it's also about the community around it. Because there's no point in having your own factory standing if everybody else around is flooded or under the rubble of an earthquake. People are not going to come and work. Your value chain is going to be disrupted. So a lot of work then engaging with them and have them engage with their communities. It's one thing that's very difficult in the developing world is government have very limited capacity, and if they can find multiplier working through these companies who then work with the community around them, then you can have a much broader impact.
Well, as we're coming up on the end of the panel, I'm going to do some summations. I think part of what we're talking about here are things that we at One Concern are very fascinated on how to solve problems, using benevolent AI to take existing data, take existing models, using distributed computing, and providing very rapid assessments of what has happened, but also building tools so that when you talk about green space, it's often hard to get decision makers to buy off on preserving land from development versus building it. And it's really difficult sometimes to show how that benefits the community and actually affects and benefits the business sector by providing that. So I know that from what we're looking at One Concern, that's been a big challenge. But I think the other things that you both brought up, government is not the solution to all of these problems by itself. And again, at this conference, we have both the private sector advancing technology faster than most government entities, but they're also the major employers and economies. And I like the thing about if your building survives, great, but what about your workers? What about the community's infrastructure? What about the services that you depend upon? So I think the summation of that says, we know going forward we're going to have more disasters. Technology is part of the solution, but people are still important. And private sector has a much greater role in building resiliency in our nations, and we need to engage them. And so the Americas Conference, or the Emerge Americas Conferences, is an opportunity to get this message out. So I thank you very much. Thank the audience and for this opportunity to talk about disasters.
Craig, thank you very much. If I can put a plug, if you're interested in this topic of technology and resilience, technology and assessing risk, I'd like to invite you to a big event that really focuses exclusively on that topic, and that will take place in Mexico City next May. You can Google it. It's called Understanding Risk, and it brings the insurance industry, the Silicon Valley companies, the satellite companies. Ron will be there, I will be there, UN agencies. If you're focused on these specific topics, innovation, the use of technology in this field of understanding and communicating risk and building resilience, please join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Let's hear it for Craig Fugate, Francis Ghesquiere, and Ronald Jackson. Next up, the future of parking.